Hi, I wonder if you could help me out. I am looking to hire a global head of growth for Automated Creative. So, a little bit about us. We're on a mission to help brands turn their impressions into intelligence. We have a technology that researches consumers by analyzing how they respond to optimize paid advertising. It's very fancy, very cool, and very successful for brands like Adidas, Samsung, Diageo, Reckitt, KFC, Pernod Ricard, Bose, Unilever, GSK, and people like NCS. So, we've been doing brilliant work for the past few years, and we want to hire someone that can help us grow our portfolio of exciting and innovative clients. So if you or someone you know have been working in sales or new business for the last 10 or 15 years and would like to talk to us about the position, please could you give me an email on tom@automatedcreative.net. Right, on with the show. Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this is a podcast about the future of marketing. Every week or so, I have the pleasure and the privilege of interviewing one of our industry's leaders, and this week is no different. I'm on a call with Tom Goodwin. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Your third time, I may add. No, I think you're up there with Jerry Dakin and Simon Kemp, but certainly in the top tier. Tom, for those of the listeners who haven't listened to the previous two episodes, could you just give the audience an overview of who you are and what you do?
So I'm Tom Goodwin. I've spent about 20 years working around different agencies within advertising, everything from media agencies, digital agencies, creative agencies, and more, and done very different jobs. I was most recently a publicist where things didn't work out towards the end. So I've now set up my own consultancy called All We Have Is Now, which is kind of designed to go broader than advertising. It's to look at how the world is changing and what companies should do about it, and to give them a sort of actionable roadmap for real change.
So in this last year, since you've been doing your own thing, what new belief or behavior has made the biggest impact on your work life?
It happened quite a long time ago, actually. I was in New York probably about 5 years ago. And I went on a date with quite a well-known sort of news anchor. And we were having incredibly sort of thorough conversations about the world and about people and society. And she kept on expressing very strong opinions towards Donald Trump and how much she kind of enjoyed having him as president and how beneficial he would be for the world. And for about 30 minutes, I presumed this was some sort of joke. I sort of presumed that she was trolling me because I found it deeply uncomfortable, this idea that someone would actually think these things. So I went to the sort of toilet and I kind of thought, what's going on here? And I came back and I realized that actually not only was she not joking, but she was actually raising some really, really good points. And she really, really knew stuff. And that the world was not in any way simple, and that we can all learn an awful lot. And this sounds slightly cliche, doesn't it? This idea that you talk to a Trump supporter and you listen, and this idea that you might be sort of empathetic towards it or challenge your own opinions. But it's really made me realize how scared we are of having our opinions challenged, how terrified we are that maybe the world is more complicated than we first assume it to be. And I've, not in a dramatic way, but I've slowly learned to absolutely love talking to people who are incredibly different to me. Again, this isn't some sort of patronizing liberal thing where you sort of hang out with quote unquote common people, as Jarvis Cocker would say. It's just an appreciation of the nuance. So I love talking to rappers. Like I love talking to furniture makers. I spent a lot of the summer in rural Georgia and South Carolina, just overhearing conversations in bars and talking to people that work on the border. And I've realized that I think as an industry, we've become so sanitized that the idea that people may have incredibly different beliefs to us has become almost distasteful. This idea that you might seek to understand someone who you assume is racist or you assume is overtly woke. We assume that the act of trying to understand them is somehow being complicit or being on their side. So I've worked extremely hard to ensure that I surround myself with very different people. That obviously leads to things like the diversity debates, which is a huge conversation that I'd love us to have. But we have to not do these things because, we're trying to become a bit better at our jobs, or we shouldn't be doing these things because it looks good or it sounds good on a podcast. We should do these things because we absolutely love challenging our thought. We absolutely love listening to people who have entirely different experiences. We love the idea that we might be wrong. We should relish the idea that we'll talk to somebody who has a completely different background in all ways. Because it's only really from working out these muscles, working the empathy muscle, working the good questions muscle, working the listening muscle. It's only really by doing that you can start to have opinions that are particularly worthwhile, I think. So it does frustrate me slightly. I think we're in an environment where the act of asking a question is seen to be somehow giving credibility to people with wild views, or it's being rambunctious, or it's being contrarian. And actually, the world needs much, much, much better questions and much more deep understanding of some of the core issues going on.
So how do you actually do that? I mean, that makes sense. I buy that we shouldn't just talk about this stuff and we shouldn't wash our behavior by being seen to do the right thing, which I think is the agency or industry default, if I'm honest. But yes, you're traveling around certain states of America you mentioned and overhearing people in bars, but, I'm sat here in Newham, which I guess is lots of different people in there, but I don't have time to go and sit in bars and overhear people. So how do you suggest that we become a better industry or better suppliers or better clients by adopting that methodology practically? How do we do it?
I mean, I think if you talk about it in sort of clear guidance terms, it sounds incredibly patronizing. It sounds like I'm sort of David Attenborough, saying go to Peckham Market and hang out in Iceland or something. The supermarket, not the country. So it's quite hard to describe it in a way that doesn't sound like I'm from a position of enormous.
Yeah, privilege. But I'm not looking for a complete and perfect answer. Actually, like what are the baby steps towards that? Towards that?
I think we're so used to having quite superficial conversations. We're so scared of actually asking people things that probe further. We're so scared of going to events that might be a bit different. If you think about the coffee shops we go to, if you think about the music festivals you might go to, if you think about the restaurants, you think about the pubs, we're less likely to go to the really shitty council estate pub. We're less likely when we're on a sort of an airline that's incredibly cheap. We're less likely to, accept that we might be on the back row and to talk to the person that's a bit next to us. We're less likely to find the people at the parties that we go to that look different. We're less likely to talk to people at the bus stop. I say a lot
Tom,
of these.
I think I'm looking for a hack, right? Because I think you're talking, as far as I'm aware, like not having kids and having a bit of time on your hand, as we sort of discussed earlier before we started recording. But how does the time poor person who's cranking out slides all week or getting campaigns live or got their eyes in dashboards, trying to get ahead, trying to make things work. And at the end of the day, the last thing they want to do is go to some weird conference. And what they really want to do is get like some meal from HelloFresh and whack on Netflix and chill out. Like that's the enemy of the thing that you talk about, I think. So what are the small steps that you can take in that direction? Because we can't all just down tools and go traveling. It's just not going to happen. So is there an online version of this that you can do that you would suggest?
I mean, it's not a time thing. This is life. The act of going to a weird market in a part of, the countryside in a town that you wouldn't normally go to because it's not as attractive. Like you do that instead of going to the nice park. it's not my place to tell people how to spend their time and how to spend their energy. But I do think having a consistent attitude towards openness, having a consistent attitude towards having better conversations, having a desire to find conversations more interesting and not being afraid to probe. I think it's less of a kind of aspect of how you divide your time and energy, and it's much more about a consistent filter that you have on your life, which is, if you're exhausted and you go to the pub on a Thursday and it's a pub quiz and you're having the same conversations with the same people about the same sort of flavors of life, then rather than doing that, why don't you do something else?
So let's put this in the context of someone who's new to the industry. So if you're a student and you're about to embark on a career in marketing and advertising, what would be your advice to those guys?
So it's really hard giving advice when you're in a situation which most people would deem to be a good situation, because the world has rampant survivorship bias in all directions. And it's incredibly easy to assume that because I've been lucky and because things have worked out pretty well for me, that if people follow similar steps, then it will happen for them. So as a caveat to all of this, survivorship bias is an incredibly dangerous thing, and all sorts of people like me get to sound incredibly smug about things. Having said that, and this is the philosophical sort of thought experiment, a friend of mine that works in film, who struggled for a long time to get into film, loves this quote, I think from some director, who says that all the screenplays that deserve to be made end up getting made. And that's a very, very provocative idea. Like, it kind of suggests that if you're good enough, things will work out. And I don't know if that is true, but I don't think it's a terrible mindset to have. I think it may well be the case that life is not remotely fair, but it is more fair than it's ever been before. And I like to think that if you are right for advertising, that somehow you will end up in it. It doesn't mean it happens easily. It doesn't mean it happens dramatically. It doesn't mean it happens quickly. But I would like people to have the sense that if they are their most selves, and if they are extremely true to who they are, and they follow the characteristics and the values that they have within them, that either the sort of universe will decide that they're really not right for advertising and they should do something completely different, or that things will work out for them. And within that, there's a degree of relaxation, I hope, that follows, because I think anxiety is extremely detrimental. I think the process of trying to fit in is extremely detrimental. So there will be a degree of sort of relaxation and calmness that will hopefully come across people, but also a sense of empowerment where you feel that if you work hard and if you focus and if you embrace the characteristics that you have, then things will work out. By far the most important thing for me, for anyone in advertising, is curiosity. Like, literally the only thing I care about is curiosity. I really, really, really don't care where you went to university. I have no interest whatsoever in what you studied. I have interest in why you've chosen to do the things you do, but it's only really curiosity that I bother about.
So what is the best bit of marketing advice you've ever heard? What is that thing that you keep coming back to, your top tip that you are more than happy to pass on to anyone who wants to get ahead in the game?
Yeah, so some people who I think are incredibly wise and I find inspiring, Jeremy Bullmore or Bullimore, if you read any of his stuff, it's incredible. Cindy Gallup, I think, has a brilliant attitude and a complete lack of fear, which I find completely empowering. But when it actually comes to the specific piece of advice, I have no idea where this came from. So that's why I mentioned the two people before. It's to read annual reports of companies. For some reason, advertising brings in so many remarkable people. Like, marketers across the world are fascinated, multifaceted, sort of imaginative, optimistic, brilliant, analytical people. And then we sort of focus maniacally on advertising and communications. And I really think, for many reasons, not least our own careers, if we can focus much more on the bigger picture, if we can really figure out what's going on in the broader geopolitical domain, if we can figure out what's happening in the world of finance, it's only really when we understand the big picture that we can understand the small picture. And apart from anything else, when you read annual reports, you realize that most of what we do is not particularly interesting to companies. There are no companies that use their annual reports to talk about how many followers they've got on Twitter. There are no companies that use annual reports to talk about a new tagline they've developed. You quickly realize that companies care about exchange rate fluctuations, or they care about risk to the assets that they own around the world. And when you see that broader picture, you can start to sort of understand the culture of companies. You can understand the reasons for decisions being made. And when you have that much deeper understanding, every conversation that you have becomes easier because you understand more about your client situation. And two, you become more credible. I mean, we've talked for years in this industry about the threat of management consultants. And how they're going to steal our business. And they're not really doing that, and they probably don't want it that much. But we also dream about the day that we might be invited to play golf, with the chairman of the board, or we might go to a dinner party and the CEO is there. And realistically, if most brilliant, well-intentioned people in advertising were asked to sit next to a CEO of their clients, I think they would quite quickly discredit themselves by assuming that the things that we do really matter to these people. And it's that depth, it's that credibility that I think will really help us.
This episode of the Shiny New Object podcast is brought to you in partnership with MadFest. Whether it's live in London or streamed online to the global marketing community, you can always expect a distinctive and daring blend of fast-paced content, startup innovation pitches, and unconventional entertainment from MadFest events. You'll find me causing trouble on stage, recording live versions of this podcast, and sharing a beer with the nicest and most influential people in marketing. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com. So we're going to move on to your shiny new object, which is the art of challenging assumptions. Fairly self-evident, but could you give us a bit of an overview on what you mean by that, and why is that the thing that you think should or will represent the future of the industry?
Yeah, so I started my career in advertising in TBWA, and it was an agency that was rooted in this idea of disruption. For some reason, ever since we got quite a lot of technology in our lives, we've kind of correlated disruption with technology. We've assumed that every company that uses, great new technology that is new is sort of quote unquote disruptive. And we presume that every company that doesn't do that is not disrupting. When you actually look at the companies that have been incredible in the success they've made, it might be Innocent Smoothies, it might be Dyson vacuum cleaners, it might be Apple with the iPhone, it might be Uber, it might be Nescafe with Nespresso. You sort of realize it's not quite as simple as technology. Like, what's really happened is that people who don't know that much about an area have kind of come in and not really been afraid to challenge some of the conventions in that industry. Now, at TBWA, disruption was all about kind of doing the opposite to what other people did. So if people were making a car, in theory, you should make a bike or something. I think what disruption really is about going through the process of coming up with solutions and going through the brief and just challenging all the things that we assume to be true, which actually may not be true. And this is where technology is a key part of that, because realistically, technology has led to very profound shifts in consumer behaviors, and it's led to very profound shifts in the kind of laws or physics of business. So technology is a key part of this process. But what we're really, really doing is looking at the elements which we can assume to be constant, and then the elements that we can assume to change. And I think that's a really, really powerful tool. And I don't think we realize quite how often we're making assumptions and quite how limiting that can be to the solutions that we come up with. And these assumptions are everywhere. Um, if you actually look at the first picture ever taken of the globe by NASA, they had to flip it because the way it was naturally took, the South Pole was at the north, and therefore the world looked wrong. Now, there's actually no reason why the North Pole is at the top of maps. There's literally no reason at all. It just sort of happened that way. I think, there are different theories, but some people think that it's because most of the power at the time is in the northern hemisphere, and that sort of feels like it should be on the top. But there's no sort of fundamental reason for that. There's no sort of fundamental reason why we have 7 days in the week. We just sort of decided together that seems about a good way to sort of divide up a month roughly, or divide up a year. So there are some things in the world that are fixed. The 24 hours a day makes sense because the world spins, but actually 7 days a week doesn't. This idea that we use BC as this moment in time when the world changed because potentially a real or imaginary character came along. There's a lot of these sort of aspects to life which makes sense, and I'm not saying they're wrong, but they become quite sort of interesting because they become the sort of frameworks in which we sort of channel our energy. And I think part of the reason this is a little bit interesting now is that the pandemic that we've all been through has actually given us a chance to reevaluate many of the assumptions that we've always made in life. Subconsciously, if you're someone a little bit like us, we probably assumed that we should go to university. We probably assumed that that involves a certain degree of borrowing. We probably assumed, therefore, that we need to get a job that's pretty well paid. Therefore, we probably assumed, that will allow us to buy quite a big house. And then we probably assumed we're going to have kids. And we probably assumed that if you've got kids, you need a garden. And then we've assumed if you're going to have kids and a garden, then you probably need to move out of a big city. And then we've assumed that you should then probably commute for quite a long time. You should probably, if you can, send your kids to like a posh school or something. And then before you know, you are like almost every single element of your life has actually been fixed because you've got massive outgoing payments, you've got a house that you own, you've got kids which have sort of forced the routine onto your life. And I think it's very interesting to challenge those things.
So once again, like I'm into this, but how do you do it? And you listed a long list of assumptions there that made me feel rather foolish for thinking all of those things, but maybe not. But challenging assumptions is for most people exhausting. To challenge the very assumptions that like they assume that like you should work 5 days a week, or you should try and progress your career, or yes, getting on the housing ladder is a very good thing. These are assumptions or kind of beliefs, I guess. How do you decide which assumptions to challenge and what is the right way to do it? And I'm not asking you to tell people how to live their lives. I'm just curious to know, to move from the philosophical to the practical.
I've never sort of come into the world as someone that ever attempts to make these things a handbook for life. So I'm personally very happy for these to be philosophical thoughts that people decide what to do with themselves. I personally don't think it's that exhausting to challenge assumptions. It's exhausting to work in a coal mine. It's exhausting to stack shelves for 80 hours a week. It's not exhausting to write down, what assumptions have I made about my life. This is a filter that you can apply through different things in your life. Again, I'm not someone that has any interest in writing a self-help book, but obviously one way to do this is to write down the assumptions that you're making for your own personal life. The notion of retirement comes from this idea that as people, we are mechanical devices that add value to a production line by moving things. And for most of human civilization, we were either growing crops or sort of, hunting antelope or working on a loom or something. And actually, I mentioned his name earlier, Jerry Bulmer, I think is 90 years old, and he's absolutely brilliant. He's probably never been more useful to the world than at the age of 90. So why would we want him to retire now? So why would we want to retire? Is it that much fun to, sit at home with a grand clock sort of ticking away in the background like my grandfather did? Is that a brilliant life? Is golf that wonderful that you want to do it every day? Or would you like to join a sort of monthly earnings call and have an opinion and have a discussion about something in business.
All right. Okay, fine. So what are the advertising assumptions that the industry should be challenging?
That's a very good question. I mean, I naturally come to this and think that actually we made an enormous number of assumptions and we base everything on a remarkably stupid way. So a couple of things. I mean, we assume that the metrics that we measure matter. I mean, click-through rates are a complete waste of time. We assume the number of followers on social media matters. We've assumed that digital advertising is somewhat about targeting. We've assumed that digital advertising should mainly be the performance element. We've assumed that the offline element should mainly be the brand. We've assumed there is a difference between brand advertising and performance advertising, and you can't do these two things together. We've assumed that everything that we do is so ridiculously complicated and expert that we should probably divide into different agencies, so around people who have the same level of knowledge and think the same way. We've assumed somehow that meetings should be incredibly polite and that to discuss differences in ideas is quite rude. We've assumed that pitch meetings should be happening in our industry and we should give away our ideas for free. We've assumed that more people working on a project is probably better than a smaller number of people on a project. We've assumed that the world is changing faster than ever. We've assumed that the world is more complicated than ever. We presume that the world is more uncertain and volatile than ever. And many of these things are probably true. And if you have a good conversation about them, you realize that they're real constraints to work around. But in that process, you may realize that these things are actually more subtle than this, and that some elements of the world are changing fast and some are not. And then you work around the things that are changing fast. So I kind of, I'm not, hopefully I don't come across as being sort of belligerent or defensive, but I really do think it's remarkable the number of assumptions that we make on an almost hourly basis.
Tom, we're going to have to leave it there because I feel if I ask another question, we're going to rocket over our half-hour deadline quite significantly. So, which is frustrating, and I'm about to say an assumption that I think my podcast should be 30 minutes long. But in fact, the data would suggest that it should be 30 minutes long anyway. So it's not an assumption. That's fine. Tom, do you want anyone to get in touch with you? And if so, how do you want them to do that?
Yeah, I particularly like it when people get in touch with me to tell me that I'm wrong and why. I particularly like it when people get in touch with me to share ideas they've had. I'm not that excited when people try to ask for free help. So I can be found on LinkedIn. I think I'm Tom F. Goodwin on there. I think I'm on Twitter. I think it's Tom F. Goodwin as well. But I think normally if you type in Tom Goodwin Publicist or Tom Goodwin All We Have Is Now, which is my new company, you'll probably be able to find me.
Fantastic. Tom, I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the shiny new Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That would just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.